mentioned yesterday that I'll offer a series of thoughts on the paramitas, the 6 perfections. A pretty classic concept in Buddhism, and we could look at the Beatitudes of Christianity. I heard something cool last week, these Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations set to music. It was really wonderful. I just realized I bet you'd like that. It was really cool. So it's just a framework, something to give us some structure to consider. It can be really difficult for not just a sincere meditator, but anybody who values growth, is interested in things like decency and integrity and values. It's like, well, how do I know I'm on the right track? How do I know I'm getting somewhere? And just looking at any frameworks like these, gives us this opportunity. That's how I like to look at it, not so much as, here's one more thing that we're not doing right, so let's beat ourselves up with it, or some strict set of standards that you're supposed to get all these in place so that you can be a better person. Not any of those, but just interest and awe in how these things change what they could mean to us, how we notice them in ourselves and in the world around us as we continue practicing. So, it looks good, huh, Pepper? In the morning we're chanting the Heart Sutra, and it's, what's in that title is like the great perfection of wisdom, which is, wisdom is the 6th paramita that we'll talk about in a couple days. And, so when they call these the perfections, I just see it as like, it offers a path, like perfection not as, something very linear that you can just achieve, but as you perfect anything, any sport, any music, you're perfecting something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you arrive anywhere, just working on it. And the key component to these traditionally is an understanding of emptiness. And it could be valuable to take a moment, in case anybody feels like emptiness is a loaded word too, that it is often equated with things like no self, or some can be thought of as being some rarefied state, but really what the emptiness just refers to is that I can't be completely separate. I don't have some separate kind of existence that doesn't rely on anything else. I'm empty of total unreliability on anything. That's what I'm empty of. But we do exist. Nobody's trying to say anyone doesn't exist, or anything doesn't exist, or any cat doesn't exist. But it's a real key to go from an intellectual understanding of that's like, yeah, okay, there's a certain number of particles and we're made up of them, and we eat things and they turn into energy and waste, and it's like, yeah, that all makes sense. And then it can make sense on more and more subtle levels that are really available to anyone. It's not, you don't have to be, have to be like a genius. In fact, this guy, there's not Harada Roshi who wrote this book, but what his book is based on was somebody who is a really famous Zen master from the 7th century who was illiterate and would have an idea and ask someone else to write it down. And one of the most, famous sutras, this Platform Sutra, was written down by his disciples. So they hold these things to be utterly available to everyone. Things that can sound odd and out of reach. The masters would say it's just not so. That's just not the case. It's just so close that it's difficult to see. It's just because it is so a part of everything already that it's so difficult to know. So what I was interested in talking about with the paramitas is, this more subtle view of them. So, if we say these words of generosity and ethical conduct and patience and diligence and concentration and wisdom, there's so much more under that surface level of how we might define the word, how we might use it in everyday language that can be useful for practice. So I think of it too kind of like, there's a surface definition. We can all use those words in our everyday language. And then there's, science and philosophy can get involved and really look at the boundaries of what we can prove empirically and show to other people, how we can explore ideas, and meditation goes along that trajectory and goes into an area of insight. And by insight I just mean, times when something that you're never quite going to be able to have the words for, but it's a lot like having a profound dream, or, I know many people now do psychedelic therapy. I don't know how many people in this room have, but, these kinds of things give people these flashes of insight, whether it's psychedelics or a profound dream. Meditation can reveal these kinds of things, and staying close to other people who have the same kinds of interests and cares can help deepen those insights, integrate them, make them stable, accelerate the process so that these insights become really extraordinarily ordinary, just a part of your everyday life, to see things clearly. So, what would each of these things look like then? Generosity and ethical conduct going along this kind of trajectory. That's what interested me here. So generosity, I like this little definition I saw somewhere that called it giving more than usual or expected. I really like that definition because other ones I've seen have said something like giving up something you're attached to, but I like this one because it doesn't say, that there's necessarily any difficulty on the part of the person giving. It's just, somebody noticed that you gave something. Like if it surprised them a little bit, then they might have called that generous. And so it's easy to consider, I think, that there could be a broad spectrum of degrees of generosity, from what most people would consider ungenerous, some kind of like hoarding or very begrudgingly giving. But then maybe we could consider then whether we really have a clear idea of what the other end of that spectrum looks like. I think there may be a default to think we know, like, oh, that must be somebody like Mother Teresa, some, maybe people like Martin Luther King Jr., somebody who gives their life for a cause to better so many people. There are, is this like this extreme of generosity? Is that what generous would be? Giving something so much more than expected. True, right? True of these people. Most of us would say, yeah, that's way more than normal. It's way more than normal to spend your life in the slums of Calcutta, right? And then what else could this mean? What would it mean if you had an idea that there wasn't anything that you could give to anyone because an insight into this concept of emptiness or interdependence had brought you to see everything already as yours and not yours at the same time. If I hand myself something from one hand to the other, was the first hand generous and the second should be grateful? So even then, the original definition of giving more than usual or expected, does that even still hold if I'm giving from myself to myself? Was there any expectation at all? Was there anything that wasn't really utterly ordinary? Maybe it's just profoundly, profoundly ordinary to just give everything freely. But how about only when it's appropriate, when it's not hurting anybody, including yourself? I was thinking about all the in-between places too, which is probably where most of us find ourselves. I've never met anybody, coming here that we don't resonate already. Everybody, cares about doing the best they can and trying to be nice to people. I doubt any of us would say that we have everything figured out and do everything perfectly either on the other end. So, there's a lot of grace, I think, in the middle too. Sometimes giving is transactional, but it can be done with integrity, with care, with consideration, with self-awareness, just with self-awareness, so that we're learning as we go. So much middle ground, all these things that we can notice, how that changes, right? How things change as we practice. I've noticed personally, some of you have probably noticed the same thing, how many words might seem at times to lose their meaning and then change their meaning as you continue practicing. We might have one definition for a word and then an experience that nothing maps onto, and through talking with teachers and community, finding out like, oh, that is that word I've been using, equanimity or clarity, or in this case maybe generosity. I remember I think it's in one of Gary Weber's books. I don't think it was a personal conversation. when he related that somebody had, was thanking him so profusely and telling him how generous he was, and he was just like, I don't relate to that at all. I'm no such thing. I'm just meeting conditions appropriately in the moment. That's it. So somebody shows up, he's engaged, he's interested, and I mean, the teacher was engaged and interested. Why would he not give his time freely like that? So, ultimately, maybe many of these words lose their meaning in the conventional sense and find a new life cleanly only as a tool of communication. So I happened upon a cool little segue earlier today. I didn't know this was going to present itself, but I just, lined these up, generosity and ethical conduct, because they were the first two listed. Oh, did I have this over here? I was going to mention all of them. Oh, I think that's later. That, the Buddhist writings typically say there's several different kinds of generosity, these three main categories being giving of material things, which I think is what people most commonly think of when they think of giving dana, they think of giving money. But really interestingly, there's three kinds, and one of them is giving the gift of fearlessness, and the other is giving the gift of the Dharma. And I find this so fascinating that of all things you could name, of all things that you could name, one is material things, one is the Dharma, and one is the gift of fearlessness. The types of generosity, types of giving. And so the segue that popped into my mind today was like, oh, this doesn't say like generosity of spirit, which is like a modern concept that I really like, that I've thought of a lot. Like, I guess probably because it's a trait of a lot of people that I like a lot. Like, I admire people that I see as having a very generous spirit. And so I had to look at that today because I was like, oh, that's not here. And so then I realized, oh, for these purposes, that's filed under ethical conduct, really, because what I'm calling generosity of spirit is, it's kindness in thought and in words and just consideration. That generosity of spirit, offering people the benefit of the doubt, having a lot of that sympathetic joy. So the words don't necessarily mean anything. We can move them here in this generation and this time in history, and they can move somewhere else. It didn't come up at all originally in this kind of work. So yeah, I think generosity of spirit really falls into ethical conduct. And the main thing that came up for me when I was considering ethical conduct is what a wonderful and important balance that is in practice, to keep it always in mind, just to keep ethical conduct in mind, because it's all about what are we doing in our daily lives, life here on earth, not in some spiritual land, not in some blissed out state, or a place where everything is sweet and lovely all the time. And this, theme of balance comes up over and over too. A lot of, traditional meditation practices have a lot to say about balancing tranquility and insight. shamatha and vipassana, wisdom and concentration, wisdom and compassion, compassion being action, compassion being what you are moved to do, as the balance to wisdom, what makes things complete. So this, this paramita of ethical conduct is, well, it's absolutely necessary. Because the thing that it's balancing out is this, maybe a deep insight, maybe a profound insight into impermanence and understanding of emptiness. And, if somebody kind of falls into that like an opium den, there's a lot of names for that, one of them being Zen sickness in the Zen tradition. Probably most of the true scandalous stories you've heard of disastrous things happening in spiritual communities are because of that lack of balance, that somebody, either just gets a lot of power politically in a spiritual community, or they feel a lot of power too, from their practice, from their faith. There can definitely be a lot of energy and a lot of clarity that doesn't necessarily go along with not harming people. Personally, my perspective is like it's kind of a no-brainer that you shouldn't go around hurting people, but I think it always bears repeating. I know that it's, it's been a big concern for a long time in recent history in meditation communities and churches. So there's a beautiful saying in Tibetan traditions, specifically Dzogchen and Mahamudra. They say, "Let your view be as vast as the sky and your conduct as refined as barley flour." That's how they put that need for balance. It's like, go ahead and open, but never think that the details in the world don't matter. They continue to matter. So that's, the classic danger of having great insight into emptiness or impermanence or no self or whatever somebody wants to call it, and then getting caught by that, getting, caught like Narcissus and never looking away again. It just sounds like being a drug addict, doesn't it? So, yeah, ethical conduct's important. And, and just a balance. So these, what I like to think of that's interesting to me too for, everybody here is like, on board already, right? So we're not going around trying to cheat people and get away with stuff. So, the practice asks us to then look at our qualities of mind, that, okay, I'm not saying the thing I shouldn't say, what's going on in my mind, am I, introducing poison just by continuing on this train of thought that's, whatever it is, jealous, vindictive, anything like that. So the things that this starts with are, they call it the 5 precepts, that are promises basically to endeavor the best one can when somebody, takes vows to just commit themselves to the path. It isn't necessarily like a commitment that means a person has to put on robes and become a monk, but monks, among other people, take these kinds of vows that include don't kill, don't steal, don't use sex harmfully, don't speak ill of people, or use intoxicants. Some also add 4 more that would be honesty, to have honesty, nonviolence, integrity, and compassion. And those, I can hear those are positives instead of negatives. So there's a balance to the negatives too, which is nice to consider. Instead of, don't do blah, 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 all of those, you could say, what am I doing to not just save lives, but, protect life, nurture life? What am I doing to enrich life? Or maybe to savor life, maybe to appreciate my own life. To give instead of to steal, to be attentive, you could say, instead of, the negative form of not having, non-consensual or harmful relationships. It could simply be, am I being attentive in my relationship? Am I, doing the best I can? Am I caring about my impact not only on the other person, but am I taking care of myself in this relationship too? Being attentive in relationships. And speaking gently and just being quiet. So how would this change then ethical conduct as there's progress? So, I feel like an obligation to mention the harm because it's so prevalent and it's so important that if anybody has wonderful insight and feels a great degree of relief, that we don't forget that our feet stay on the ground. So I feel like there's, a moral imperative to mention that. And that said, then what about the positive side of that? What about as someone grows in a good balance of wisdom and insight, as ethical conduct grows, have we considered what that really looks like? Who are our role models for that? Might they be invisible? Might they be more difficult to find because they may not be, with a very few exceptions, very well known, famous? When I think of, some of the people I've met who did have difficulty in their communities, the leaders tended to, have a lot of charisma. And so there can be a magnetism, but is that like who you want to be in your heart? Or is it just something shiny that draws a lot of attention? It might be a useful exercise to consider, who you think that you really deeply admire, who's gone pretty far down this path, or at least cares deeply about this, perfection of ethical conduct. And what does that mean? The perfection of that, when we say perfection in terms of seen through the lens of emptiness. Well, if everything is mine, this is where people get into trouble. If everything is mine and everything is yours, then I can take whatever I want, right? And there's no ethical problem. That's the dark side of it. But then what I'd offer is this potentially invisible side. The positive side is, well, why would I take anything at all when I already have everything I need? I wouldn't do anything that's not necessary. Why would I do an action that would hurt myself? So I think I'm going to tell you a few things that Harada Roshi has to say about this. This guy is living. He has a monastery in Japan, and he teaches in Germany and Washington State and all over the world. But he wrote this book. Well, he didn't write the book. He gave a bunch of talks, and they turned it into a book. And it's based on the Platform Sutra, which was about the life of the guy I told you about from the 7th century. But here's a few things to close on what Harada Roshi has to say about ethical conduct. These are all different ways of saying, do not put that distance of 108,000 miles between yourself and others. All of these precepts warn against acting in ways that create separation instead of unity. And this one is about this balance, avoiding harm. What about our responsibility to society? Today's world is so complex with so many challenges. Non-thought doesn't mean turning our backs on the world and greedily seeking our own quiet, thought-free space. To be empty of extraneous thinking means to see, hear, smell, and taste what is present, but not to think further about it. When we see things without getting caught on them, our essence can flow freely. We feel a paternal responsibility for everything that exists without being pulled around by our attachments. We must live this, not just know it conceptually. And I'll close with this one. The more we seek to be more complete, the more our essence becomes diluted. Everyone wants to be successful and happy. Yet even as we accumulate knowledge and luxuries, we become less satisfied with our present and less certain about our future. No matter how loving our family and friends are, we still feel a deep emptiness. Why do we become so melancholy? People think that happiness has to do with making money, or that being moral is about upholding doctrines. But an abundant, happy life does not come from listening to a teaching. And a harmonious home and a productive job do not guarantee contentment. These things cannot last forever. What will you do when they are gone? How will you then fill the vacuum inside? People think that the solution is to do good things for others, but that is not the case. Eventually, we still become insecure and melancholy. We have to see through all of these misperceptions to realize our true nature.